I was anxious about my project. The first couple of weeks of my class, Transforming Education, Knowing, Learning, and Being, had flown by. I thought that starting my courses in an area where I was most familiar would make the project easier. I was wrong. Being surrounded by educators actually made it harder for me to choose a collaborator. Not many people knew I was in school, and that made asking for support even more nerve-wracking. After chatting with my husband and my daughter about my nerves, I took action. Melissa had been my first choice for the project, but we would be in new territory. Melissa and I had been friends for over 22 years. We first worked together when Melissa was my lead teacher. I had followed Melissa as she became an assistant principal, a principal, and then a cluster superintendent. My anxiety wasn't about having difficult conversations. Melissa and I had had many of those, and there was a deep level of trust and understanding between us. I was nervous because in all the years we had never talked about spiritual knowledge. The new ground was so unfamiliar that it felt overwhelming. Melissa enthusiastically agreed to meet with me and be a collaborator on my project. We decided to walk and talk together at a local park. Melissa and I easily fell into conversations around the work we had done together when we were open to middle school as a principal and a teacher. As we looped the track, we reflected on creating a school that believed in leading a community of excellence. We talked about what it would take to replicate that work. The middle school created a culture where teachers, staff, students, parents, and community members felt valued, important, and heard. I wondered if this could be done when laws were dictating curriculum. How could schools still be culturally responsive with teaching? I wanted to know if Melissa saw an impact on responsiveness because of the new laws. I was shocked that these questions yielded limited discussion. It turned out that the laws weren't impeding classrooms like that. Instead, the questions led to a conversation around change and how daunting it can be to change anything. I brought up how true universal participation was missing in the educational system. Places often try to promote that everyone can be involved, but in reality, everyone is not equally valued. Melissa asked what universal participation looked like then, and I had thoughts to share around a framework that included study, action, reflection, and consultation. We discussed how around the world, small bands of people are changing their communities using this framework. As our conversation continued, I worked to listen with a spiritual ear. I didn't want to have answers and responses at the ready, but to be patient enough with the conversation to see where things were headed. Having an open mind allowed me to notice the connections between the work of community building outside of school and the work I was doing in schools. Once out home, I reflected on the conversation and distilled three ideas. Leaders in a school need a vision to see school in light of the historical reality of students attending in order to respond to the multiple ways of knowing that students bring to school. Change does not occur without grassroots participation and initiation, and people have to know that they are working collaboratively with others to bring about change. I also realized that in my current position, I could support teachers with my broadened understanding of universal participation and ways of knowing. In this way, whatever the curriculum, teachers could learn to respond to the cultural needs of students. Melissa and I met again. We had both given thought to our previous conversation. As we enjoyed the nice walking weather, we had a great conversation about the importance of feedback to bring about change. I linked the idea of accompaniment to feedback. I had a moment of clarity about how my own lack of feedback from others was impeding my feedback process. I realized that not being given feedback, was keeping me from giving needed feedback. The teachers I supported needed actionable feedback to make changes in their practices. And then this led into a discussion around transformation of oneself to then be able to transform those around you. Melissa had trained me to give feedback many years prior, and with that feedback and accompaniment, my instructional practices had transformed. Melissa reminded me that I wasn't the same educator from 22 years ago and that my story was one that could be shared. In sharing my story, it would allow other people to see others. It would allow people to see others in a different way. My transformation could help support in changing my current environment. Later on, I would really think about the power of storytelling and how people all around the world use the art of storytelling to pass on knowledge. After 3 loops around the park, Melissa and I continued our conversations under a pavilion. Melissa had thought about the impact of small groups on change. She noticed that teachers use small group instruction to meet student needs, and professional development was also centered around small groups of people working together. The change that happens in schools isn't in large groups, but in small groups. And I noted how this tied with the conversation around a framework for action. Melissa wondered what it looks like in a community, and I explained that it's not hundreds of people studying together at one time, but lots of smaller groups participating in study, action, consultation, and reflection. Even if the materials being studied are the same, the context differs. With the common goal of transforming yourself to then transform the world around you, you can create lasting change. Small groups of people study and discuss how the learning can be applied to their own reality immediately. By the time this conversation was done, I had an idea about how I could organize my final project. I would tell the story of learning with Melissa. After about 2 hours of talking, Melissa and I parted ways. In between the meetings with each other, Melissa and I shared articles to read. Melissa shared articles around collaboration, student grouping, and coherence in education. And I shared readings on the coherence between the material and the spiritual, constructive agency, and universal participation in education. Our third meeting, For our third meeting, I printed out the statement from the Baha'i Office of Social and Economic Development on the coherence between the material and spiritual, in hopes that Melissa had read the statement. Our conversation recapped some of the ideas from the previous talks, and Melissa said, I see you brought the statement with you. I read it. I pulled out the statement from my pocket, and we began to discuss the contents of the statement. We realized it would be best to read it aloud and then discuss it. The rest of the walk, the rest of the walk, I was reading the statement and then we were discussing the implications of the ideas. When I read the quote from Abdul Baha, material civilization is like a lamp, glass. Divine civilization is the lamp itself, and the glass without the light is dark. Material civilization is like the body. No matter how infinitely graceful and elegant and beautiful it may be, it is dead. Divine civilization is like the spirit. The body gets its life from the spirit, otherwise, it becomes a corpse. It has thus been made evident that the world of mankind is in need of breaths of the Holy Spirit. Without the spirit of the world of mankind is lifeless, and without this light, the world of mankind is in utter darkness. Melissa had a keen insight to say, but we are in the lamp business. Melissa and I explored the idea that as members of state-sanctioned instructional institutions, we essentially are responsible for the material education of children. Even when parents want students to learn about spiritual concepts, there is a strong belief that school isn't the place for that learning. We both acknowledge that changing the current system of education feels daunting. I expressed the idea that instead of changing the system, maybe it's crumbling and people should be rebuilding its replacement. The world is always going through this process of disintegration and integration. And I use the idea of grass growing through concrete, explaining that even when people can't see the grass, it is growing and working. I shared, we need more people in the light business. The day after Melissa and I walked, Melissa sent a thank you card. It read, thank you for taking time to engage me in your work around change and education. I have enjoyed our walks in the park and you pushing my thinking. You have always found a way to share knowledge with others and ask insightful questions that lead to change. I place the card on my desk at home as a reminder that change comes with study, action, reflection, and consultation with others.